Hello and welcome to Beyond the Hub, where we talk about everything from sales to marketing to your business as a whole. And today we've got Crevan O'Malley here, who is VP of Sales at HubSpot. Crevan, welcome. It's so nice to have you. And for those of our listeners who don't know you, can you give us a quick rundown of who you are and what you do?
Of course I can. And Bridget, thanks so much for having me on the show this time around. I'm delighted to be here. So as you said, Crevan O'Malley is my name. I am the Vice President of Corporate Sales here at HubSpot. I run that part of the business for our EMEA region. We've a growing team in the upmarket space in HubSpot, so it's been a particularly enjoyable role for the last number of years. I'm coming up on 5 years with HubSpot, which is hard to believe. It's 5 years into 24, 25 in tech sales. I worked with Dell very early in my career, Oracle more recently, and I spent a good chunk of time in between the two in startups. So a good mix of startup, scale up, which is a lot of our customers, and then the more corporate enterprise space as well. I've worked in those companies too. So it kind of gives me a good sense of our user base, our prospects, the customers we talk to day, and that's very, very helpful.
So who better with all that experience to help me go back over the sales trend report that HubSpot released for 2024, dig into it a bit, see where we are now that we're coming up to the end of the first half of the financial year. So in that report, which I will link to down below for those who haven't looked at it, it said inflation, competition, lead quality, reaching decision makers, and then longer deal cycles were some of the top challenges. Do you still think that's true? And if not, what would you put as the number one biggest challenge? And then I guess, how are you trying to get over that?
Yeah, I think no shocker to this conversation or to the listeners. Like there are still very, very material headwinds and challenges. I think a lot of the things you mentioned that the report surfaced kind of talk to the macro environments that we find ourselves working in. And I think that's obvious to everybody, both economically, politically, socially. There's just a little bit of unrest. And when you're in moments like that, I think consumer sentiment is lower. The sort of propensity for B2B budgets to be approved and for the spending cycles to grow is more difficult. And I think we're seeing that. The report itself threw up some really interesting insights, and the fact that it was a kind of a global group of participants was really interesting, with quite a few from the UK, of course. I think from my perspective, the only thing I'd add to the insight that the report shares is, for me, and even in good times, I think the number one challenge for sales leaders and perhaps business leaders even more generally is to hire, retain, and help grow through enablement and challenge great people. I think, the challenges don't necessarily become any less in good times. In good economic times, when we feel we have a tailwind, we set ourselves really ambitious growth targets, and we still need great people to fulfill those. So, finding, sourcing people to help grow your team, taking on some of those challenges that you mentioned, absolutely. But I have great confidence that if we can get the people piece right, then those challenges can be tackled with a bit of confidence. Because, we'll probably talk about this later, but one of the other trends I'm seeing, especially in that upmarket space, is the period where a sales professional turned up alone on a deal and managed to close a deal. That's kind of absent now in the economic and kind of environmental space that you summarize there with those challenges. You need to turn up with experts. You need to turn up with a team, and that team-based selling approach is something we've worked a lot on, and that requires these great people I talk about to have a lot of interpersonal skills, as well as some like cutting-edge sales skills, and that's a challenge, but it's an exciting one. And I think gradually we're moving in a positive direction. And when the economic winds change, I think teams that are adopting those strategies will be even in better shape to capitalize on those.
That's really interesting, because I do think that people they want something to blame for why things are hard. So they don't necessarily look internally and see how they can change things internally. And one thing I think that we've seen that kind of mirrors what you've just mentioned about how you need a team to sell now is on the other side, where you're selling into, is the sheer number of decision makers, and having a team your side that can kind of answer those questions from all those different decision makers is surely going to help. But is that something that you've taken on in your approach to sales and kind of closing deals?
Yeah, you're touching on something really, really interesting. And I mentioned I run the corporate business. We have an amazing small business segment, and we have a mid-market team, and then obviously we've got the corporate team. And that's pretty standard practice to segment sales teams in terms of the size of the customers and the prospects they would be looking for. There are different demands at different end of the market. And I think when you're working in our small business team and maybe in our lower end of our mid-market team, not exclusively, but our sellers can gain access to the decision maker quite early in the process. Yes. If it's an entrepreneur, this individual wants to move quickly, deals can be done quite quickly because it's a kind of clear and present need in the business. The further up market you go, you can have situations like that for sure, but you end up in quite complex organizations and having to navigate those. And I talked about, the skill set of the salesperson and the requirement to continuously enable them. And one of the things and one of the skills that we're noticing in an increasing way challenging our pipeline and our predictability of our business is a rep's ability to manage that multi-threaded challenge. Different personas on the prospect side, different levels within that organization, an ability to understand, is this person a decision maker, or is this person influencing the decision maker, and making sure that you cover both, but understanding that the time invested in the different personas is critical. So that is a massive part of what we're trying to enable those great people that I talked about that we hire at the start, having them show up, being able to adopt really sophisticated and impactful multi-threaded approaches where we lean on multiple levels of people in our business. So at the core level, you've got the rep engaging with a prospect, the manager, that business unit's director, the VP, right up to our C-suite. All of these people are available to the rep to call on and add in. And that's just in the sales function. We have deal desk individuals who specialize in the construct of commercial offerings. We have pre-sales people who bring in a massive amount of technical expertise and subject matter expertise. We have our partner community, of which you guys are a critical part of in our UK market. And all of these individuals have a role to play in a deal that's won. When you tell the story of a deal you win, it's amazing how many people have touched it. And we rely on the sales rep to be able to navigate that story. And I think that's a huge challenge. But I think and I am in a sales role, but for sales reps, that's an exciting challenge to really hone in on those skills and become excellent at that part of the job.
And that is something that the report touches on a bit, is the importance of giving those sales reps resources to enable them to do that job even better. So there's like demos, market research, social content. That's all very valuable. But what do you think is kind of the most effective in empowering your sales teams to close deals?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, because you talked about it, the enablement function within sales, certainly within SaaS sales, has just developed incredibly over the last number of years. Pre-pandemic, that cross-functional support looked very different to what it does today. I think one of the biggest challenges we have in terms of enabling reps, and you talked about some of the sort of methodologies and the tools, and we use all of those, is that sort of creating real moments in training and practice can be challenging. In previous times, new reps were probably sitting beside somebody who had a lot of experience, a lot of skill, and almost informally, just listening to that individual, you would gain an awful lot of knowledge and you'd progress. That opportunity doesn't really present itself in a hybrid working world. So with sales leadership and the go-to-market enablement team support, we've got to create moments where sales reps practice what we want them to do in real game time. I remember speaking to somebody recently about this, and I think sales typically use sports analogies a lot. It works for some, not for everybody. But I think there's an interesting connection between the amount of time athletes will spend practicing versus the actual real, let's call it game time.
Mm-hmm.
And in sales, we're time poor, and it can be almost the opposite, where sales reps can be actually practicing in game time on calls with prospects and customers. And I understand that, but I think what we need to do is trying to create space for reps to be able to practice, to do role plays with each other, to listen to calls. We use call recording tools, and a lot of the responsibility of the leaders in HubSpot is to listen to those calls and give good coaching advice on how to do those better. So making sure with our enablement colleagues' support that reps are getting enough practice time to hone those skills before they show up in the real game. That's a challenge, but I think that's something that we're materially trying to change in 2024.
And I guess that's a bit of a cultural shift. It's very difficult to take sales reps out of their job because their targets and KPIs are all revenue based most of the time. So taking them away from what they might think is super important time to close deals must be quite difficult. But I suppose this leads us into quite a nice conversation around AI, which helps free up time for sales reps. And I think the conversation has moved away from being, where do you stand on AI, to actually, how are you using it appropriately? Like, everybody is using it now. So what can you automate with AI, and what needs a human behind it?
Yeah, I mean, I think we'd both be in trouble with our respective companies if we didn't talk about AI, but generally it's fascinating. Just to go back a little bit, you talked about the enablement point we just mentioned, and actually the sort of challenge that goes on in the minds of a sales rep who's like, well, okay, but like, you're taking me off the phones and I'm not now selling anymore. The report touches on this. The amount of time that a rep in the current environment is spending actually selling is I think less than a third. So they're already, to try and do the job as effectively as they can, turning up time poor on sales engagements, and 2/3 of the time are admin or whatever it might be, not progressing deals. So I think there's two things in there that are really interesting. The first is, if you're going to run enablement training strategies and programs with your sales team, they've got to be high impact and they've got to be high value. And we've ran both good and less so. And when it's less so, it creates a lot of frustration, and it is certainly time wasted. When it's really honed in on the gap and the need that a rep feels in that moment, then the energy created is enormous, and the positivity and the skills that people can literally replicate the very next day, it creates an energy across the floor. So I think it's absolutely important for sales leaders like myself and our go-to-market colleagues to really think about, okay, we don't need to run multiple training programs in a period. We need to understand what the data is telling us, that where the real gap is, and we need to train and enable to that. And if we do that in an integrated, connected, positive way, where reps' contributions and it's dynamic, then they will respond to that in a really positive way. And AI comes in here as well. I think from an AI perspective, it really is a transformational moment in tech and in the wider society we live in. I think the benefits of AI applied correctly will be enormous. And what we're trying to do is understand where some of that wasted time across business is housed, and how can we unlock that so that automation and technology and AI can service, so that individuals and humans can focus on that creative element of the job, and they can connect with people and build relationships, and obviously progress deals in a sales piece. When I think about it specifically, I'm thinking about personalized outreach, the amount of research and desk-based research that it takes for our best reps to create, a perfect email or prepare for a piece of video content or go on a call. That can be reduced significantly by the use of AI. We can also look at our install-based customers with our customer success team members, and the data will give us insight into what the next best product or offer to recommend to that customer might be based on what the data underlying is telling us. And then I think the other way is outside of customers, when you're talking about prospects and your territory planning and you're wondering about what accounts to go after, there's a whole host of research tools, websites, G2, company accounts, everything available. AI can actually quite quickly bring all of that together and give you, half a dozen really key bullet points for that person who does this role in that industry, what might be a struggle for them at the moment. And then the key follow-on for that is your individual, your sales rep, you're turning up interesting from day one. And that's so important because we talked about being time poor. Customers and prospects are exactly the same. And if you're bringing insight from moment one, then you're interesting and you're likely to be listened to, and the conversation will go from there.
I love that. And I guess it's about being a bit more intelligent with what you're asking AI to do, because a lot of people can do that. They can say, write this email for me to this persona, but it's all that pre-research going on that's really impactful. I like that. I just want to go back to what you mentioned about getting that buzz in the office when you've done some really great enablement sessions and your team are really excited. And I think that brings us on to a really nice point in the report, which highlighted hybrid work, and that is the most effective for sales team. And I guess some managers might miss having their team physically present for whatever reason. So what advice would you give to them on that?
Yeah, I'm one of those leaders. I definitely, when I'm not in the office for a period of time, I miss it. I mean, before the pandemic, I was somebody who went to the office every day, and I was a sales leader. And to me, in its simplest form, that was somebody who had their team in front of them and kind of created that team dynamic and obviously, that common focus on targets and metrics and performance and success and celebration. It was very easy when people were in front of you. That's not the experience anybody is having today.
Nope.
And in fact, I think the change is positive. The reason we've come to the change was incredibly challenging for everybody going through that period. But I think where we've ended up is a working environment now that is probably one that could have taken us 15 or 20 years to get to. And I say that because ultimately, and you want to hire the best talent you possibly can, people who are high performance appreciate choice and they appreciate flexibility. And if you're creating an environment where they can turn up and do their best work, well, why wouldn't you want to do that as a leader or a manager? And there's no doubt about it that the optimal way to attract top talent now is to give them that choice. Of course, there's guardrails. Of course, there's support structures. And I think even for remote employees, and we have 3 options when people join our organization. You can be fully remote, you can be hybrid, or you can be office-based. And there's even a little bit of movement across all of those. But we're talking about flex. You need to create moments in the week or the month where, a bit like the enablement conversation we had, I'm not going to the office because I have to, or I have to show up. I'm going to the office because there's a piece of work or there's a piece of progress that I can make that is highly contingent on my ability to network and collaborate with individuals. And with all the digital tooling we have, and it's amazing, I think you still find it hard to top those moments when teams come together and have that conversation and the creativity is flowing. But you have to make it meaningful, and it has to be helpful to the end goal, which is obviously the progress of the individual. I think hybrid is here to stay. I think that's probably an obvious thing. And I think for managers who are struggling managing in that environment, what I would say to them is, just step back, and your sense of struggle is probably to do with the pressure of the target, right? And you're wondering, would I have more control if the individuals were in front of me? And I think all the data says to that, the answer is no, you wouldn't. But secondly, park the numbers and the pressure and the target for a minute, and I know that's incredibly difficult, and focus on the person behind the role. You've put an enormous amount of time and effort into selecting this person. They had incredible skills and competencies, probably displayed ability to problem solve, work autonomously, work as part of a team, all that amazing stuff that we check for in the interview process. And when these amazing, talented individuals walk in the door, we want to put them into a box, and they have to operate in the way that we want. And I would just go back to that and go, you know what? If we can support, enable, and facilitate that talent to work as part of a team, right? It's not a free-for-all. Of course it can't be. Then I think you'll get the best results. And definitely, I mentioned it, for those individuals, the opportunity to choose the work practices that suit them, get the best out of them while creating space to connect. And I think those individuals will operate with a sense of accountability and responsibility then. So, ultimately you get the best results. I think the report suggested that's what's happening.
Yes.
And for sure in our actual experience in HubSpot, that's certainly our experience too.
It is. And I think, so I guess when the pressure gets a bit too much, like you said, people want a bit more control. They might get a bit more micromanagey. But bringing it back to HubSpot just for a second, you can see everything in HubSpot for your team, and you can track what they're doing. So you don't physically really need them there, do you? You can just see it all.
You can. And look, I think, CRM systems give power because they surface data and track progress in a very material way. So ultimately, if we talk about sales, there's so many metrics and targets that we work towards. It's very, very easy to see where the work has been done or not. And that is not a physical location thing. That is an application to task that an individual has, whether they're remote, flex, or in the office. So absolutely. And I think that needs to be part of the sort of social contract between a manager, her or his team, the individuals in the one-to-ones. Here are the expectations. Here are the things we're measured on. And in a hybrid working world, there's a high degree of trust and accountability that you're part of the team. And if an individual isn't, it's not from a desire to be a micromanager. It's that data will surface really quickly. And I think that's not what we're trying to achieve with a hybrid working environment. We're trying to have all the benefits of choice, the ability to have access to even more talent, because location is now not the key driver. But I think those individuals need to take responsibility, as we all do, that, okay, there's a contract here. This is a job. I'm going to be paid to carry out certain tasks. And in sales, I think the opportunity is fantastic, because if you carry out those tasks and you improve consistently and you get good results, well, your remuneration is linked to that output. So for sure, there can be performance issues. There is in every single industry and every single company. But by and large, what we're trying to identify at that recruitment phase one is people who can operate effectively in that environment. and that level of, dealing with people as adults and humans as opposed to a metric. And if you can create that trust, I think that's when, high performance really begins to excel.
I love that. And I like what you said there about throughout this whole thing, it's about focusing on the person, putting aside maybe the targets for a minute, putting aside the company. It's about the people. And I think that links in really nicely to something else the report mentioned, which is referrals. So referrals has come out as a top source of high quality leads, and everybody knows that. And I guess when people are feeling a bit more cautious, like you mentioned at the start of this conversation about, political changes, environmental changes, referrals are kind of the way to go. So is that something you strongly encourage in your team? Do you have any strategies or recommendations for people around referrals?
Yeah, no, I absolutely do. I could talk a lot about this. I think even if we talked about focusing on the person, just think about us all as individuals, like what your circle is doing, is buying, is of interest to you immediately. It doesn't matter what the marketing budget or the latest advertisement for that product or service is. If your best friend or your sister or your mother or your brother is talking about something, you're immediately interested. And I think it's like that in business too, and maybe even more so in these challenged periods that we talked about at the start. Ultimately, B2B buyers and procurement teams who are highly, highly skilled, their job is ultimately to de-risk the buying decision. And unfortunately, for a lot of sales teams today, the ultimate way to de-risk it is to do nothing. And we're trying to create value. We're trying to create progress and projects where people are comfortable committing. But the ultimate endorsement of your product or service comes from people who have experienced it. I mean, it's a very obvious thing to say, but that's what a referral is. And I think some people think, well, we don't have brand awareness, or we don't have an ad in the tube station, or, we're lacking the massive stands at events. All of those things have a return. Of course they do. But when you're trying to make decisions and there's trade-offs between decisions, there's no doubt that if you were able to create a lead flow from referrals, they would probably be your highest value leads. They would probably close a little bit quicker because they've got the endorsement from somebody they respect. And you would probably end up being closer to having a positive relationship, which opens up cross and upsell opportunities, because they were clearer on what it was that you were going to solve. Everybody turns up to a prospect vendor conversation today informed. Nobody is talking to a salesperson for them to tell them about the features, the functions, the price, what something does. A significant amount, the majority of the research is done before your sales team ever even speak to a prospect. And if some of that can be influenced by your customers, people who will speak positively, I think that's amazing. So for us, I think what we're trying to do is have an awareness of us, that is a real piece of funnel for business. And what you try to do for prospects as they consider joining is immediately try to be creating in them not just that potential customer relationship, but an advocate and somebody who sees a win-win for, of course, in this case, HubSpot, but also for them as the customer. And what are the opportunities for HubSpot to showcase that business and to give them opportunities in webinars or at events, speaking engagements, that kind of co-marketing where brands turn up to the market together with a shared message is really, really powerful, because that is something that can, even if you don't have that connection of a personal relationship, if I work in an industry and I see HubSpot there doing amazing work with one of my biggest competitors, it's incumbent on me to have a conversation and see whether I can benefit from some of that efficiency as well. And I think that's a key thing that people pre-sale need to be concerned about. It's not just a post-sale thing. And I think, look, ultimately, nobody is going to act as a referral if the fundamentals are not in place and if the fundamentals are not right. And by that, I mean, they are paying for a product or service. They had an expectation that it would solve a particular problem and add value. Is it doing that?
Mm-hmm.
And if it is, then humans like to share their successes the same way, we do share our challenges and our pains. And if you can be in that successful zone with your relationship, having them articulate that to the market is absolutely powerful.
And I like what you've said there about how it's kind of not just sales responsibility here. Like they can do pre-sales work, they can get the customer happy, but actually there's the service teams, like is the product doing its job? There's marketing, all of these different teams, which kind of goes back again to what you said earlier, where it's not just one person influencing things anymore, it's a whole team together. And I really like that. And when it came to talking about sources for the leads in the report, obviously mentioned referrals as a really big one for high quality leads, but it also talked about social media being another top source, which kind of goes into what you're just saying there about how people like to communicate their successes and things. So have you seen that remain the same throughout the first half? Is it changing? Are other channels kind of coming in here as a top source for leads, or is it just social media?
Yeah, I think the observation I have in 2024 is that the demand, the lead sources across the board are all challenged. And that probably talks to the macro that we discussed at the start. So that element of creativity, that sort of human in the mix, as opposed to completely relying on your technology to come up with strategies, to think about, well, where are my target audience turning up if we don't have the same flow from the website? What is actually happening? Where are people going for their information? And I think that shifts over time and always has, and it's continuing to do so. If anything, with the development of technology and just frankly the development of society, the speed at which things change is increasing constantly. And there's no doubt social will become even more powerful in the years ahead, because the generations that are coming behind us, that's all they know, and that's where they get good or poor experiences with brands. And the one thing I would say to companies, and obviously we're having a sort of a conversation around tech SaaS, which is where HubSpot shows up. One thing I've kind of observed over the last number of years working in the industry is, in terms of the market's perception of your brand and the service that they expect from it, they are not comparing you to your competitor. So, for example, when I think about a bank, if you simply think that your prospects and customers are comparing you to a second bank in the experience that you give them, that's incorrect. What they're doing is they're probably comparing you to an amazing B2C experience they had in a hotel, or with a travel company or an airline. And those moments where we really can identify great customers and poor, but great customer service, those people go back in to their B2B roles and they have their personas in marketing and sales. And if they're not receiving a B2C type level of service, they get frustrated. So it's incumbent on brands, even exclusively B2B brands, to make sure that their message is articulated across social and across a whole load of other channels. But I think the human nature being what it is now, a lot of that research that we know people are doing before they ever want to speak to you is happening on social platforms and social applications. So first of all, you've got to have a presence. It's got to be consistent with the message across the other channels. And I think if it is, and there's that consistency of value and insight, then you will definitely nurture individuals through that funnel. And as we're talking about, the salesperson is by no means the most important individual in the chain. There's a whole pre-sale dynamic that goes on, and there's absolutely a post-sale dynamic that is really, really critical. Maybe even more so in tech SaaS, because the ability for people to make decisions on their stack and pivot if they want to, if they're not receiving the service, that is incredibly possible. So they can move, and they have that mobility choice that we talked about when we talked about our employees. Our customers do too. And that's a risk, but it's also very positive, because ultimately, I talked about for referrals, the fundamentals have to be right. The fundamentals have to be right. And if they are, then you've got a good basis on which to partner for the long term. And that's obviously what we're trying to do.
I like that. And we're kind of coming to time now, but I want to put you on the spot for one last question, and just ask if there's one piece of advice that you would give businesses going into the second half of the year to try and make it successful.
Yeah, I think, look, I'm not going to come up with anything too radical. For me, I think there's, with all the technology, with all the AI, the key thing to focus on in business is the people dynamic. And for me as a leader, there's two key groups of people. The first, and it should be the people we listen to and take a pulse from and adjust strategies if needs be, is our customers. So that market sense of where the problems are, what customers need today, how they want us to show up. You've got to listen to those cues to remain relevant and to be seen as a business and an individual in that business who turns up with a valuable point of view or a perspective on the problems in that particular company or even that industry. So absolutely listen to your customers. And the second group is your teams. It is very, very challenging at the moment. It's challenging for individuals before they ever show up to work. Prioritize the person, hire well, but create the space for them to do their best work. And I think if you do that, they develop, they actually flourish in terms of working autonomously, making decisions, progressing, solving for their and for your customers. And that dynamic and energy that can be within the business is a more positive one when you do that. So look, there's a lot to be done when you're talking about the tactics and the practicalities of a deal and closing a deal. But ultimately, on both sides of that engagement, there's a group of people. And as a leader, have a sense and a perspective on how those communities are growing and evolving and changing. And you're trying to connect them in the most optimal way. And I think if you focus on that as a leader, it's probably going to serve you well in the second half of the year.
I love that. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to make sure to pop a link to your LinkedIn profile below, and as well as the sales trend reports, that people can go and have a look at that and reflect on everything that we've just discussed. But thank you again, Crevan. Hopefully we can get you back on in the future.
And thanks for your time, Bridget. Enjoyed the conversation.